I'm really excited about this particular event. There are two reasons to it. First is we haven't been really able to communicate with our community because of the situation we have with COVID-19. So we hope everybody is doing great at their home workspace. So be safe, stay home, and keep away COVID-19 from your life. So this gives us an opportunity to meet with all of you across the region, across the boundary, and connect with you virtually. So this situation has also forced us to think on the innovative front, how we can make a VMUG event happen. And that's where we pitched in Joe from VMware. And we are really great to have Joe with us. So welcome, Joe. Welcome to the show.
Nice to meet you all.
Thank you. So before I start, let me introduce myself. My name is Jatin. I am leading the VMUG Pune customer community. Then I'm joined by Vivek. I'm joined by Vijay, who is customer leader for VMUG Bangalore. And then I'm joined by VMUG headquarter team. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the show. vLeaderConnect is a webinar series. It is aimed to connect with industry leaders like Joe. The idea behind this is to get the perspective from technical leaders and understand on the personal and professional front. So it's going to be a good webinar series. Trust me, this is just our first episode, so hang in there. As I have said, we are joined by Joe Beda. Joe is currently working as principal engineer at VMware. Joe arrived at VMware via the acquisition of Heptio. He is a leader in the cloud native movement, and he has also founded a company called Heptio. So welcome, Joe. Previously working at Google, Joe has co-created Google Compute Engine and filed his first ever Kubernetes project commits. So that's really great, Joe. Why don't you start with yourself and share your story about your professional and personal journey?
Yeah, sure. So I've been, let's see, I graduated college in '97 and started my career at Microsoft, moved up here to Seattle then. And first of all, thank you everybody for joining me at this odd time. You know, there is no good time to actually schedule any sort of real-time communication between the West Coast and India. It's like, it's just a disaster for everybody involved. Yeah, moved up here to Seattle and started my career working on Internet Explorer, which, you know, was an interesting time to be there. And then about 7 or 8 years in, switched to Google, did a whole bunch of stuff at Google involving real-time communication, a lot of the stuff that turned into Hangouts and sort of, essentially predated Zoom in a lot of ways. So Google Talk and all that stuff. And then did some ad stuff, machine learning back then, and some big data analysis before, we had our second child and then came back to work, and I really had a hard time making myself care about ads anymore. And so, and then looked around and we ended up starting essentially the infrastructure cloud stuff at Google, which turned into Google Compute Engine. And then along the way, you know, recognized that for us to really have an impact on the industry based on sort of, you know, where the market was, it was absolutely critical for us to really shake things up. And so that's really one of the things that predicated Kubernetes. And then took some time off, explored other options, and then one of the product managers that I worked with to launch Compute Engine was ready to start something. And so we started a company called Heptio with the goal of bringing Kubernetes to mainstream enterprise. And so did that for about 2 years before being acquired by VMware. Been at VMware for, you know, a little over a year now, going on a year and a half. And it's been great to actually sort of really continue that mission that we started with Heptio, with VMware's relationship with customers, with their deep understanding of the problems that enterprises face, and really being able to bring that together with what we've been thinking about around, Kubernetes cloud native containers, and really making the relationship and the interface between IT operators and their client teams be much more fluid and much more cloud-like, not just when running on public cloud, but regardless of where you're running it. So that's what we're doing with Tanzu and the cloud native work at VMware.
Good to hear, Joe. And it's really interesting that you have experience spanning from different types of organization. I thought of not asking this question, but now I'm tempted to ask this question. You have worked with an organization called Microsoft in 2000 to 2005 and 6, right? And now we look at the Microsoft of after 2014 to now. Do you really see that there is a cultural change the way Microsoft has reorganized themselves?
Well, I mean, I haven't worked at Microsoft for a long time. Obviously, I still have friends that work there. One of the other Kubernetes co-founders, Brendan, ended up at Microsoft. So I was there. I left Microsoft around 2004. That's when I joined Google. And so it was 97 to 2004 is when I was there. And, there's parts of, Microsoft that I think are very consistent from that time till now. And I think, a big part of that is the relationship and the affinity and the empathy that Microsoft has for developers, the understanding of the importance of an ecosystem for platforms. All of that stuff, I think, is really in Microsoft's DNA. And I think it's served them well with the shift to cloud. Now, clearly it was a hard path there, but I think, everybody likes to laugh at Ballmer bouncing around going developers, but like, he's not wrong, right? That is a key part of being successful in this world, is having that focus on what actually creates those sort of beneficial, virtuous cycles that really drive ecosystems. The attitude at Microsoft when I was there was very, very aggressive. And, the whole consent decree and the antitrust trials and all that stuff was a really interesting time to live through there. And, when I was there, and it was stark contrast when I moved from Microsoft to Google at the time, the focus at Microsoft was really about defeating competitors. It was a very competitive environment where you benchmark, success based on winning against competitors. Whereas when I joined Google, and this was a much, younger Google at the time, so 2004 was right around the Google IPO. Don't be evil was the unofficial motto at the time. The focus of Google, which I thought was refreshing, it took me a while to wrap my head around, was really like, what is the best thing we can do for customers? How do we actually, like, if we make sure that we're doing right by our customers, everything else will follow. And I think that, with Satya coming on at Microsoft, it's definitely a different company. I think, there definitely has been a cultural change there. And I think, as Google has grown, it's gotten much more like every other big company in terms of just, needing to make the numbers and that type of thing. The one thing I would say is that any big company that you look at, whether that be, Microsoft or Google or even VMware, it's not just one culture. It's not just one environment. It really is depending on where you end up, where the teams are. So there are pockets of Microsoft that are very much the old.
And what was the initial thought process to start the Kubernetes, and when we already have Borg?
Yeah, so I never worked on Borg directly. I used Borg as a consumer, and when I joined in 2004, and as we were building the first backends for Google Talk, which was with a bunch of coworkers that I worked with on IE. So it's just it's a small world, and it's interesting through your career how you sort of, stay connected with people over time. But as we were building Google Talk, some of the first stuff that we were running was on Borg. And so, that project started in 2004, 2005, something like that. And so by the time, cloud was a thing and we were ready to do something in the container space, Borg was already almost 10 years old. And so, the decisions around Kubernetes are really, are multiple. So the first thing is that, the experience with Borg really, led us to understand that there were other ways to manage and deploy software beyond sort of starting from the VM layer on up. And so seeing the benefits of containerized workloads through the lens of Borg really gave us essentially a roadmap for how these things could work into the future. And having that roadmap was very, very instructive for Kubernetes. And I think, one story early on is that, we were doing compute engine. We got to the point where you could make an API call, get a Linux machine and SSH into it. I showed it to my boss at the time, who was like old school Google. And he's like, okay, yeah, now what? Right. And I think, honestly, that question of like, I have a machine, now what? That is the problem that you look at all the DevOps tools, you look at all these systems, it really is there to answer that question, now what, right? Like getting a prompt on a machine really is just the start. Exactly. It's not the end of the story with respect to shipping applications. And so Borg was very much more of like, that now what from the lens of how Google looked at it. So that was one thing. The second thing was that, GCE was relatively late to the market compared to Amazon and AWS. And so, we could have a great product, but, competing against that sort of entrenched ecosystem is very, very difficult. So the other thing that we were looking at is how do we shake things up so that we can actually create opportunities for Google to really sort of reset things and move the conversation to a place where Google can compete on a more level playing field with GCP versus AWS. The next thing is that, because everybody inside of Google was using Borg, which was containerized with this sort of higher level interfaces, and everybody outside of Google was like starting with raw VMs, by and large, there was a bit of a mismatch there. We wanted to make sure that the experience that internal folks had mirrored the experience that external folks had so that we could actually over time converge the internal platform with the external platform. That whole sort of eating your own dog food, drinking your own champagne point of view is a critical piece of making sure that you're building the right product. Now, we did look at doing Borg itself. There were a couple of problems there. Number one is that, it was a 10-year-old code base. It was built for Google. It was very entangled with so many other Google systems. It would have been a ton of work to essentially detangle that from those systems and be able to present it to the rest of the world as a clean system. Combined with, it was built for large scale from the point of view of number of nodes, number of jobs. It wasn't built for large scale in terms of the number of tenants, right? And so it was built for how many teams are you going to have in a company like Google? 10,000, 100,000. How many accounts do you have on a major cloud? Like, hundreds of thousands, millions of accounts, right? So there were orders of magnitude difference on some of the design principles that were actually, designed into Borg. Beyond that, we also recognized that, the only way to really change the industry was via open source. If we had launched a Kubernetes-like service as a Google-only type of thing, everybody would have said, hey, that's really interesting. Okay, now we're going to go off and do this other thing, right? And so open source was a way to really sort of make it ubiquitous. And so, and then, taking a 10-year-old C++ code base and open sourcing it and expecting anybody to actually be able to even build the thing, let alone contribute, is one thing. Whereas, looking at the same time at the sort of community that was forming up around Docker with Go, it really hit that sweet spot around a systems level project that was approachable enough that we really thought we could build a community around it and really make it be a true open source project. And so you add all that together, and those were a lot of the things that really sort of, made Kubernetes launch the way that it did.
Yeah, it's really interesting to know there was a lot of learning before starting Kubernetes it was came through from Borg. I would like to know particularly on the language selection where Go has been selected for Kubernetes, right? So what is your thought process and what is your idea when you put across, because it's very tedious today, right? When we are selecting a product, the language selection is like, we have to consider all the ways, right?
Absolutely.
Still the scaling. How did you choose Go as a language for Kubernetes?
I think, it's interesting. I think, it was sort of the right thing at the right time. Number one is that like there was sort of a, proof of existence proof in terms of Go being workable here with Docker. So that was definitely a piece of the puzzle. From my point of view, I looked at Go, and I actually wrote a blog post for this. I can dig up the link. A couple years on after Kubernetes on why we did Go. It was for the I can find it, but a big part of it was, Go is really sort of a sweet spot in terms of being low level enough that you can write system software in it, but high level enough that, you can remove a lot of the complexities that you get with something like C or C++. Building Go is go build, right? There's the whole Go format thing of like, hey, here's the right way to format, it just reduces the amount of arguments and it really makes it easier for people to approach it. One of the things I like about Go is that it is a language that's meant to be obvious. It may be verbose in places. It may be that, it's a little bit more elbow grease versus using something with templates and metaprogramming and all that. But when you read Go code, by and large, you can see what's happening. There's not a lot of subtlety there. And so it's really a language in my mind that lends itself towards people being able to sort of join in, pick up, and be productive relatively fast.
Oh, that's good to know. Actually, you touched base on the when you say about the Borg, there is a large amount of scales that has been not considered, right? So, do you think that the current number of clusters or nodes that is running in Borg at Google is that maybe it could be more than Kubernetes clusters or nodes that we are running today in any of the organizations? Do you think that?
That's a really interesting question. Like, the number of machines under management by Borg compared to the number of machines under management by Kubernetes at this point.
Exactly.
I don't know. I mean, like, this is one of those things that's actually really difficult with Kubernetes and open source in general is understanding usage, right? I think when things are open source, all sorts of people use your stuff and they never even bother telling you about it. I mean, there are companies that will have some sort of limited sort of, foam home capabilities from their open source, but, you got to be very careful as you do that to make sure that you don't freak people out. And so, yeah, I don't know. My guess is that there would probably be more machines under management from Kubernetes right now versus Borg. But that's a really interesting question.
Okay. What was the last cluster nodes that you had when you are leaving Google, the number of nodes or clusters in Borg? You remember?
Oh, I can't share that. Like, there's some things that I feel comfortable sharing. There's certain things that Google tries to hold very, very close. Yeah. And like the size of their infrastructure, number of machines in production, all that stuff is, they're pretty secretive about that. And I don't want to. I mean, I did get special permission, I gave this talk right before, like a couple of months before we introduced Kubernetes, about sort of like containers at Google. And I had to go through a bunch of, approval processes, from Urs directly, who was, the head of all infrastructure stuff at Google, to have permission to be able to say that Google at that time started about 2 billion containers per week. And so, yeah, even being able to share a number like that was a pretty sensitive thing at Google.
Okay, now I got to know why you focus more on the cluster management part. Right, it's really a high scale actually.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting space for sure.
Yeah. Sure. Thanks, Vijay. There was some really interesting question, and I really didn't knew that Borg was actually written in C++, and then it has shifted to Go. Joe, most of the community members we have in this particular webinar are system administrator who basically do the VMware administration. So I know you have been part of a lot of developer community, but this may be something unique for you. How would you address something like Kubernetes to the cloud administrator? So before I move into VMware Tanzu, I would like you to just give your thought on cloud native. What does it actually mean? And when a system administrator hear the terms like cloud native, Kubernetes, uh, where he is looking at?
Okay, yeah. So I think the interesting thing is, I would start with the definition of cloud. And I think cloud in our industry, like so many other things, DevOps, Agile, like whatever, right? It's like these words get overused to the point of almost being useless. And so I think, cloud to some degree, the definition depends on where you sit. And so for a lot of folks at the sort of, IT operator administration point of view, cloud is really about streamlining, operations of, large amounts of computers, right? It's sort of being able to manage more machines with less people. And then when we look at public cloud, it's really sort of taking some of that function, like, it really becomes the hardware operations as a service is the point of view for what you get out of public cloud. And that by and large has been, a lot of when VMware has said cloud, a lot of that has been from the point of view of the infrastructure buyer. How do we actually create more regularity, more scale, better tools for managing a lot of machines? Now, what we find in a lot of organizations is that the interface to application teams, whether those application teams are writing code directly or whether they're running off-the-shelf software or whether they're partnering with external parties to develop or customize applications, those teams, they view cloud in a very different way. Traditional IT, oh, you need a new computer, you file a ticket, it may take a week or two, and then at the end of the day, you get a machine that you can log into and configure however you want, right? That's essentially the same contract between application teams and their IT departments as we had when, people were rack and stacking physical machines, right? But now instead of, going and buying machines from Dell, and having them delivered to the data center over a course of a couple of months. Now, instead, what you're doing is you're doing this virtually using a console or some level of automation there. But still, that interface is very much of treating each machine as a unique entity. From the point of view of application teams, when you look at cloud. It's really, like, I like to joke and say it's like not talking to a sales guy as a service. Being able to walk up to a public cloud and in the course of like 2 minutes get the machines that you need is an amazing experience, and it's an amazing enabler for application teams to have that self-service ability. And so from the point of view of application teams, cloud really is self-service, elastic, meaning, sort of use what you want when you want it, and API driven, meaning that like the application folks can actually automate the infrastructure that they're using. And once you can start writing code and automating that, it really changes the way you write applications. So in my mind, cloud native is really building applications and processes and teams that are set up to take advantage of cloud from the application team's point of view, meaning like automated, self-service, not having to file a ticket to do your day-to-day work, right? And so, from VMware's point of view, from what we're looking to do with Tanzu and things like Project Pacific, is really give those IT operators the tools, the power tools, so that they can give their application teams a cloud-like experience regardless of where they're running. Right, because we want to be able to, and that again is like it's again more power tools, not just about managing a lot of machines, but managing a lot of customers and reducing, because nobody enjoys ticket queues, right? It's like you're either waiting on one or you're servicing one, and it sucks either way, right? And so really, it is about taking that drudgery, building automatic systems, making everybody more productive so that they can focus on other things versus a lot of that sort of day to day. Like, oh, I got a ticket. Let me, follow these 37 steps manually to get something provisioned.
Right. Absolutely correct. So I started my career in 2014. I was working purely as a system administrator. I remember the conversation which were happening at those particular days was on-prem versus public cloud, right? And today in 2020, it's very clear that it's not a single cloud, single platform. It's a multi-cloud, multi-platform. And I feel that's where VMware is also putting up its heavyweight efforts to make on-prem infrastructure the cloud native. So can you please throw some light on the Tanzu portfolio, which VMware is working on?
Yeah, so yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think that, you know, it's fascinating because, like, you know, you rewind the clock a couple of years and everybody's like, well, everything's going to run in cloud and there's only be three big suppliers, right? And what we've seen in the meantime is that, like every technology, I mean, like mainframes are a growing business for IBM. It's not about replacing, but augmenting and providing more options. And so what we see is that the landscape for enterprises over time just gets more complex. So it's not, you know, private data centers or public cloud, it's private data centers and public cloud and edge. And we have things like GDPR and, you know, data sovereignty and all these things that are driving the need for more, you know, complex, you know, infrastructure being necessary. And so our goal with Tanzu is to bring that cloud native experience and toolkit to, you know, to IT teams so that they can actually have that toolkit regardless of where they need to run. And so we want to work with our vSphere colleagues to make sure that Tanzu works great with vSphere, whether you're running vSphere in a private data center in a colo or with something like VMC, VMware Cloud for AWS. But then we also want to make sure that if you're going native to the clouds also, you have a consistent tool set across all of this stuff. And so we break down Tanzu across build, run, and manage. So run is really about getting that sort of, you know, Kubernetes substrate everywhere in a consistent way. The premier product there is Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. And that comes built into vSphere 7, but also can be a hosted service built to, you know, delivered through Tanzu Mission Control, which is our managed side of the house, and also delivered independently for other platforms. So that's sort of the run level that sort of sets our foundation. And then there's a question of providing the right tools for application teams, whether those application teams are adapting existing software to run on Kubernetes or whether those application teams are development based and writing new code, app modernization, that type of thing. And then finally there's manage, which is really that problem of how do you manage this at scale? Because when you have a complex enterprise, you find that, like, there's a lot of teams, there's a lot of consumers, there's a lot of infrastructure. How do you match these things up and look across your entire sort of, you know, production estate and make sure that you can keep track of that, have consistent policy, have our the way we talk to customers being like, it's got to be all VMware up and down the stack. That's not the world we're living in.
Yeah, totally agree with that. One question I would like to get from audience, and we have received plenty of questions. Most of the folks are asking, VMware already had a portfolio, or is it now a different service altogether?
So I think, you know, we're in the process of you know, essentially evolving a lot of the ideas proven out in PKS such that they're more embedded in the Kubernetes substrate that we're basing this on. And so I think when we look at PKS, there's a lot of great features in PKS. It really is a great product from the point of view of delivering a turnkey enterprise-ready Kubernetes solution. The basis for the management underneath PKS is Bosch, which is part of the Cloud Foundry ecosystem and was really built as part of the sort of the infrastructure automation layers underneath Cloud Foundry and as part of the Pivotal portfolio, Pivotal application service and all of that. One of the things that we're doing is we're taking all of the sort of benefits and features that you find in something like Bosch, and we're rebasing those features on top of Kubernetes. And we're looking to do it in a way that is componentized and more flexible in terms of the environments that we can bring it to and the types of benefits that you can get. So we're in a transition period here. One of the key things that we look at where we see this being a great example is the work that we're doing in upstream Kubernetes around this effort called Cluster API, which is really about using Kubernetes patterns, Kubernetes idioms for managing Kubernetes clusters itself. When you look at that, it's very much of a like, let's look at our infrastructure, let's look at the desired state, and let's reconcile that over time and make sure that things are self-healing and all that. A lot of, in common and a lot of learnings coming out of the Bosch world that we're applying there. But we're doing it in a way that's more decoupled. So, as we build out the service for essentially doing VM image patching and creation, we're separating that out from the role
natively within vSphere the way you guys are managing VMware virtual machine. So that was really great to see. It was fascinating to see how VMware has actually adopted this particular technology and felt like it's not a big change in any way. So
yeah, I think to some degree these are worlds colliding, right? Because we have the vSphere, vCenter world, and then we have sort of the cloud native world. And I think, our goal out of this is to view this as, an opportunity for folks who are very much skilled in the vSphere world to be able to start learning and adopting these things as they make sense, as they face new challenges in terms of, working in the world that exists with cloud and the demands coming from application teams to actually have more self-service and control. But we wanted that to actually be, an opportunity, not a threat, not something that was hugely disruptive to current practices. Because, nobody makes any transition overnight, right? These things are always over time, and you always have to make sure that you're careful about, reliability and making sure that you meet the business needs while you're doing these transitions.
Absolutely correct.
Maybe I'll take one question.
Yes.
Maybe I thought since we started with Google and then we left the company Heptio, so I just thought of taking some insights on that. Maybe can you share some your experience of your dating experience, I would say, meaning co-founder dating experience. That's what I could say to see from your 80% blog that you wrote, like in 2016.
Yeah. So, I mean, that blog is old. I need to update it. But so I spent about a year as what's called an entrepreneur in residence after I left Google and before we started Heptio. And that's essentially a partnership with a VC firm where they give you some support, you get to know them, and it's really a relationship building tool. And so that was really about them getting to know me exploring what starting a business might look like. As part of that, I think there's a lot of opportunity to go ahead and, meet folks and figure out, what you're looking for in a co-founder, what type of businesses you want to explore. My conclusion coming out of that is that founding a company is really hard. And, you see and hear a lot of stories around conflict between co-founders. And so, I ended up, starting a company with Craig, who I'd worked with before. And I think that, that was a good decision. I, definitely looked at, starting a company with some other folks. And I think maybe it would have worked out, but I think, it's a tough journey to start a company. And so having somebody that you know well and that you trust and that, you're looking to partner with over years is absolutely critical. It's not a short journey either.
Finding a co-founder is really a tough job. But what can you tell one such thing that you waited for Craig to be a co-founder? Because I understand that you met a lot of people in your journey of finding the co-founder, right? So what exactly, meaning the one thing that you could see that I found, okay, Craig is a guy that I should go with a co-founder. Yeah.
Well, I think, so my wife is an MD, right? And what I think is fascinating watching her experience is what makes a good doctor. You don't know if you just go in for a clinic visit, right? Like the stuff that makes a good doctor is when they're faced with exceptional circumstances and they're tested in ways, and that's very difficult to actually figure out from the outside. So for me, when looking at a co-founder, when things are going great, it's easy to actually have a great relationship. I think the question is that what is that relationship going to be like when things aren't going well? And I personally wasn't comfortable. It was very hard for me to get to know somebody and found a company without having that experience of working with this person when things aren't necessarily going your way. And so for me, it was really building that confidence that I was waiting for. My father was also an entrepreneur and started a company and sold it also. So I'm second generation programmer, second generation entrepreneur. During the whole sort of acquisition process for his company, there was a falling out between the founders and he got pushed out. And so for me, that was an instructive experience to actually see, at least, hear from him firsthand about how these things can go.
That's really interesting to know about this journey of finding a co-founder. And it's really good to know.
Right.
Yeah.
Nice question, Vijay. I mean, it certainly touches upon some of the personal aspect of Joe. So that's really good to hear. Joe, we have got plenty of questions around Kubernetes. But before I go ahead, I wanted to discuss a bit. Strategy, or it was more over to complement Kubernetes with great set of technical tools which VMware has?
Honestly, I don't have a lot of the background in terms of how those things were, that stuff was decided on. I will tell you at the technical level, I know that, with respect to the supervisor cluster and networking, there's some requirements there that come out of NSXT. I don't have full visibility in terms of the trade-offs that were made there, honestly. I think, what's interesting is that when we look at Pacific and the way that turned into product with vSphere 7, I think that there's really sort of 3 different capabilities in Pacific, and they sort of manifest in different ways. One of these things is the supervisor cluster itself is being a new interface that can be handed to application teams directly to start that sort of self-service journey so that application teams can start, getting stuff done without having to actually go through intermediate systems. The second thing is the native pods and the ability to essentially have a container runtime that was highly optimized down to the sort of ESX level. And then the third thing was the ability to bring up essentially, open source, fully conformant clusters on top of that align with application teams that, and those things came to market as Tanzu Kubernetes Grid. A lot of my focus has been on that guest cluster TKG side of the house. And I've been working with the teams on vSphere around the other stuff. The product decisions there were really driven by them. So I don't have all the insight there, unfortunately.
Right. Makes sense. Most of the folks are asking, if I have my Kubernetes cluster currently running in Azure, can I manage with VMware Tanzu?
Yes.
Oh, that's great. Good to hear that.
Well, I mean, just to be clear, so we have different products. So We don't have a automatically managed Tanzu Kubernetes grid running in Azure. But if you're using AKS, you can attach that cluster to Tanzu Mission Control and get, you know, some of the sort of the oversight and the management benefits from that. There will be things that we don't do with TMC, like we won't drive upgrades or, you know, creation or deletion of clusters in AKS, at least not right now. But once you do have a cluster, you can attach that cluster to TMC and sort of bring it into the global view that you have in the global policy management point of view.
Good to hear that. So now I will switch over to Siddharth. Siddharth, why don't you bring up some of the questions from a question and answer feed? Let's take some of the community questions we have.
Okay, so I'll just take a couple of questions because there are too many of them. So there's one question from my colleague Sarvan, and he's asking, did Joe always inspire to create a technology disruption apart from Kubernetes? Did any other technology catch his attention? So Joe, how would you comment on that? So are you a technology disruptor, or how do you define yourself?
Well, I think, when I look at my career, I'm a bit of a polyglot. I like to jump in and do new things and start new things and explore spaces that, are not well understood. So I enjoy that ambiguity of being able to come up with new solutions. I think that's why, coming out of college, I had a choice of joining the NT kernel team or the Internet Explorer team. And so I'm like, hey, I'm going to go to the place where things are more dynamic, where there's going to be more change. And I think, that disruption and that sort of dynamicism creates opportunity. It creates stress too, but it also creates opportunity. And so same type of thinking when I moved to Google. At that point, Google was, still relatively small and somewhat unproven. A lot of my colleagues at Microsoft thought I was crazy for going to Google. And then when I was at Google, before we started Compute Engine, which was disruptive from the point of view of inside of Google, we also started up or helped start up a project for what eventually became Chromebooks and Chrome OS. Our goal there, was, at the time was like, hey, could we do a specialized operating system for netbooks? Remember netbooks? And that essentially turned into Chrome OS. That was, location-wise, I was working remotely from Seattle. The Chrome team was largely based down in Mountain View, and so that made that relationship difficult. And so we kind of did the cloud stuff as sort of a plan B. But I think it also speaks to the just sort of like I like starting new things and exploring new spaces.
Good to hear that.
Okay.
Yeah, Piyush.
Maybe on those line.
So
maybe on those line, I'll just take one question on that.
Yeah.
So from your years of experience, do you see are we focusing more towards the technology delivery, or we are focusing more towards a solution delivery for the business needs?
I think both. I mean, one of the things that I like to tell folks is that, in sort of the product development, world, there's roughly, product managers and engineers. And product managers, in an idealized world, are the ones that think about the business, understand the customer needs, write some sort of specification, and then it's, engineers that go off and build that. And I think what I find is that, as people become more senior, as they become more effective, the lines between these things really start to blur. So it really is the puzzle of what's technically possible combined what is useful and sellable. And I think if you try and view these things independently, oftentimes you're going to find yourself in a bad situation where you end up building something technically interesting, where it's very difficult to build a business around it, or you find yourself trying to pursue a business where the technology is not ready yet, and you're not ready to actually deliver on the promises that you want to make. And so I think it's like, to be successful, you have to really look at things holistically across those different dimensions.
Oh, that's good to know.
Makes sense. Piyush, why don't you
Yeah,
go ahead?
so
Share
yeah,
the
we have
question.
one question that has been asked over multiple times, and that is, how do you see VMware TKG fares over other competitors in the market?
Well, our focus, I think, I don't like sort of naming competitors, in forums like this. I think it's, there's always a ton of nuance and it's easy to be misinterpreted. What I will say is the things that we're focusing on with Tanzu. So number one is that we want to make sure that we can deliver to our customers and be a partner with them regardless of where they want to run. So our focus is that it's a complicated world. You don't just have infrastructure running in one cloud or in one location. It really is spread out across all sorts of different environments. And so we're really focused on making sure that we deliver the solution regardless of where you need to run versus tying it to the underlying infrastructure. In some ways, this is taking, again, like looking at cloud, there's the infrastructure management layer of cloud, and then there's the developer experience layer of cloud. And with public clouds, those things are conjoined in a way that you can't untangle. We're looking on delivering that experience without tying it to the underlying infrastructure. And we think that's a unique value proposition. And we think that there's very few folks who are really delivering on that promise. Beyond that, we also are focused on adapting infrastructure in a way that makes sense for how organizations are constructed, right? One of the interesting things for us when we built out Google Container Engine is that, inside of Google, people tend to run a small number of very large infrastructure clusters, right? When you look at Borg clusters are very large. Comparatively, there aren't that many of them. When you move to cloud and somebody can press a button and get a new cluster with something like GKE, it changes the consumption patterns. They end up creating a lot of clusters, and oftentimes those clusters end up getting paired with a team or a business unit or a function. And so what we find is that the world has shifted in the cloud world from having a small number of very large clusters to having a large number of smaller clusters. And so we're building Tanzu with that sort of large number of small clusters in mind. And I think when you look at the experience of how people use vCenter and vCenter clusters, it mirrors that also. Oftentimes people will have different vCenter clusters for different business units. They don't view it as one big, huge pool of resources. There's different layers and different partitioning. And we really want to build, Tanzu so that it actually works well from that point of view.
Makes sense. And I feel, Joe, the current scenario in technology ecosystem is that organizations tend to complement each other rather than compete aggressively with each other. So I feel we see that kind of ecosystem growing a lot. I mean, consider that Cloud Native Foundation group. We see companies like SAP, we see Microsoft, we see Red Hat, all are coming together and creating a technology ecosystem which is beneficial for everyone. So I feel it's a win-win situation now to be in a technology space.
Yeah, no, it's super exciting. And I think for me, I found that I had to decide where I wanted to put my talents, and I don't want to see a world where there's one single cloud that dominates everything. I think that having a more open ecosystem is the world that I want to live in, right? And I don't, so that's one of the reasons why I'm excited about Kubernetes. I think it creates a huge amount of opportunity for so many folks versus concentrating all of the benefits to a couple of large companies. Yeah, so I think it's a super exciting time to be involved in this.
Makes sense. Siddharth, do we have any other question in the line?
We have plenty of questions, so I think we'll run with the agenda first. You might have some questions listed out, so let's finish those, and if time permits, probably we'll ask those questions. Otherwise, we'll send these questions to Joe, and we'll get it addressed later, and that's how we'll share it with the community. How about that?
Right. Makes sense. Absolutely. So Joe, we have plenty of questions. Most of the questions are on the competition part, on the comparison part. So I feel we have covered that thing. One important thing is how do you look at the open source community? I mean, for us as a system administrator, it's really fascinating to see an organization investing their time to build a product and then eventually make it as an open source. Why would an organization do something like that?
I think, there's a bunch of good reasons for doing open source. I think, so first of all, I think it creates a clear contract with your customers, and it creates, especially from the point of view of, up and comers in the market, it creates a level of comfort and engagement that's difficult to do with pure proprietary, especially as you get more towards the infrastructure space and like the DevOps space. The risk associated with taking on a proprietary closed source solution is more acute, and especially for smaller companies trying to be part of that world. I think that it's a way for you to partner with your customers in new ways. I think oftentimes versus you being the vendor and the customers being the consumer, you'll find those customers that bring their own talents to the ecosystem, and then that creates a more, both complicated but also fruitful relationship with your customers, where they can actually get involved in a more direct way. And I think it also, creates ecosystems that are larger than any one company. Having open systems means that, there's going to be more people putting their efforts, more customers, more users, more addressable market than what you're going to get when you come at it on your own. And I think, that's been proven out with Linux, right? And the interesting thing about Linux, for example, is not Linux itself, but the things that Linux has enabled. Like, we would not have public cloud, we may not have Google without having something like Linux as being the footprint on there. And so I think what you find is that, these things empower, new ways of doing things in ways that you can't predict. So I'll have investors ask me like, hey, what are the Kubernetes startups that I should be investing in now? And my answer is often like, I would instead look at what are the businesses that Kubernetes empowers that weren't practical before. Because those are the things that I think we're going to see the explosion in the growth from. So yeah, I think open source is a really fascinating model. Now, I also think that from a business point of view, you have to be smart and considerate about open source. You have to understand how are you going to monetize, making sure that you're clear with your communities and your customers about where your lines are, where you're putting your effort in there. I think, people understand generally that, if you're running a business, you have to make money. And so I think, being upfront and sort of wearing your agenda on your sleeve, as they say, in terms of being very open about where the cut lines are, I think is a critical part of being successful with open source.
Absolutely correct. I have very interesting question, and it could be very simple for you. And the question is asked by Razwan. He's saying that what would be your advice for vSphere admin in current cloud native movement, which we are into?
So I think my advice by and large would be, don't view public cloud and cloud in general as competition, as a threat. View it as an opportunity. I think that it's not an either or proposition, but instead it's an opportunity to rewrite, reinvent the way that IT is delivered in your organization. And if you do so, you can have huge impacts in terms of the efficiency of your company, and really up-level the type of work that you're doing. And so I think our job from VMware's point of view is to give you the tools to be able to do that, so that it's not an either or, it's a yes and. Yes via vSphere, yeah, and cloud, not a vSphere or cloud. Because I think, honestly, the patterns with cloud native, with cloud, it really is sort of, a force of nature, right? You can't hold back the tide. It's going to happen. So it's really a question of finding a way to use that to your advantage, being effective with it, versus trying to deny it and hold back. And hopefully, VMware and vSphere and the work that we're doing with Tanzu can be a tool and a partner in that journey versus versus a threat.
That's really great. Before I wind up this session, we only have 2 minutes left. I would like to respect the time constraint which we have. Have you been ever part of any of the VMUG event, or is it your first VMUG conversation with us?
I think this is the first one that I've actually sort of really participated in, I think. It's just been, you know, I do a lot of conferences and talks and all that. But, you know, the VMUG community is different enough that I think it's taken us a while to get to the point where we can have this nuanced conversation with products in the marketplace and be able to say something concrete about how these worlds relate. So I'm really excited to be able to put some detail there and really have these types of conversations.
Right, that's really great, Joe. And I feel for VMUG, it's very unique to have a speaker like you. So we are really thankful for that.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
We really appreciate that.